You may think it is strange that we spend some time talking about the thought of Muslim India, because to some extent this is pre-partition Pakistan, pre-partition India. And you may have associated Muslim thought in India with the Jama'at al-Islamiyya and with the thoughts of A Allawi and the various currents that have gone into forming the ideology of the Islamic movement in Pakistan, and to a much lesser extent in Bangladesh. However, these are not isolated events. The effect of Muslim Indian thought on the unfolding of the events leading to partition of India is really a very important current, and I would say it's an important species, if you want to call it that, of general Islamic thought. The reason I'm focusing a bit on India is really to show you that there's no such thing as a monolithic Islamic thought. Islamic thought is colored to a very large extent by the circumstances and conditions of the countries and of the cultures in which people have emerged. There are very, very few figures in Islam, in modern Islam, the notable exception being, for example, Jamal bin Qayyim, who have been able to transcend the cultural particularism of their place of birth and of their culture. So if you find what we consider to be seminal thinkers like Muhammad Abdi and so on, they are entrenched to a large extent in the culture of the Islamic thought, although it is universal at one level, is also particular and peculiar to the region at another level. Most Muslim thinkers have tried. Some have succeeded, but they have tried to transcend the limitations of geography and limitations of culture so that their message reaches beyond the nation states in which they find themselves. But in reality, the fact of the matter is that most modernist Muslim thinkers have only connected with other Muslims at one level, but not necessarily at all levels. And there is something that is uniquely particular to thinkers coming from specific parts of the world. Now, I have just looking at the map of the Muslim world, you find that it's really broken into what I would call five zones. And these zones are, to some extent, cultural, to some extent, ethnic and racial. But you can talk about them in the following. There is the Arab zone. That is the zone of Arabic speakers. And that encompasses about 200 to 300 million people. Now, the thinkers who use the language of Islam and the medium of Islamic thought to present their ideologies generally address the Muslim world as a whole, but in particular that segment of the audience that can relate to their language and culture. There is another zone that is related to the Turkic worlds. And the Turkic world is again about 200 million people. If you take Turkey and the various Turkish-speaking countries of Central Asia, we are again talking about a zone of around 200 million people, which again produces its own peculiar flavors and its own peculiar orientation. And it is sometimes difficult to go through this cross-cultural boundaries in which Muslim thought is expressed from one culture and one location to another. There's another zone, which I would call the Iran-influenced zone. And this is probably the zone of the Shia. And again, it's 200 million people. These figures are quite hard to work. About 60, 70 million Iranians, most of them are Shia, and there's an equivalent number of Shias in Pakistan, Iraq, and other countries, which gives you a Shia-speaking or Shia-oriented world that is Iran-centered at around 200 million. There's another zone which is distant from the centers. It's not so distant now, but it was distant, which is the Malay-speaking zones. And again, we're talking about 200 million. And the last two zones relate to the Indian world, where the Indian Muslim world, which is probably more than 200 million, it's about 300 million, which is composed of the remnants of the old British India Empire and includes the Muslim states of Pakistan and Bangladesh. The last zone, of course, is the African zone, which is again about 200 million people south of the Sahara who, in one form or another, relate to the Africanness of Islam, in equal measure to the universalness of the deen. Now these are substrata, they are not particular categories, but many scholars do approach the study of Islamic thought to some extent as it's colored by these various peculiarities of each location. Now there is no doubt, for example, if you take the thoughts of Shia Muslim thinkers, so A Allawi or Ali Sharia, people like that, they do appeal to them, they appeal to all Muslims, but they have a specific message that is oriented towards their own group, their own subgroup. Now, sometimes the message to the subgroup is more profound than the message to Islam or to Muslims in general, in which case they can be subsumed under the category of Shia Muslim thinkers or African Muslim thinkers or whatever. So, the importance of studying the mindset of Indian Islam is from that perspective. I would say that the effect of that movement on Islam as a whole is much less pronounced than the effect of that movement on Muslims inside India. So, and that is, it seems to me, the trend that has, just by observation and by research and experience, the trend, the balance between a universalist perspective, which requires a mindset of a person who has transcended national, linguistic, cultural, and ethnic boundaries, and the Muslim thought of people who are more entrenched in the dynamics of their own societies and their own countries, is perhaps an important distinction to keep in mind when you approach some of these thinkers. Of course, you have thinkers, particularly activists, who have had universal, I won't say pretensions, but claims, are nevertheless denounced by other Muslims because they are considered to be parochial and particular. A case of mine, for example, is the way in which the Iranian Revolution was met by most of the Muslim world. It was met primarily. The first response was to respond to it as an Islamic challenge. The second response was to cut it back to a specifically Shia phenomenon. The third approach is to cut it back into a specifically Iranian approach. So this is a way of countering or a way of responding to Islamist thinkers from particular parts of the world, which also goes to some way in explaining why the pan-Islamic movement has failed to crystallize in any significant way around the world. Although there are obviously adherents to it. At some point, culture, at some point, local requirements and local claims of loyalty take precedence. Not necessarily in that person's Islam, but in the way that he orients his Islamic perceptions locally. So in India, we have a situation where we've explained how, in the previous lectures, how the rule of Muslims became whittled away and finally collapsed and was replaced by British rule. And here we have a situation where the entire world view, as it were, of Muslim thinkers, in the sense that Muslims should only be in a position to rule other Muslims as well as non-Muslims, but Muslims should not allow themselves to be ruled by non-Muslims. That perception, that experience was turned on its head, and you have a situation where a number of issues came to the fore. Some of these issues still confront multicultural entities, such as Malaysia, such as some of the African countries like Nigeria, where you have to contend with the presence of non-Muslim minorities or majorities in some cases. How do you respond to that? And all of these challenges, all of these complexities were first aired, were first discussed in a significant way in India. Now, after the rise of Sayyid Ahmad Khan and the pro-British movement, or the movement that said that the salvation of Muslims in India lay in close cooperation with the ruling power, and that lay in a reinterpretation and rereading of the Quran Kareem in order to make it more of a scientific textbook rather than a revelatory affair. the situation changed fundamentally just before and during World War I. Now, a number of things happened. One of the most important events that shook the perceptions of Muslims in India regarding themselves as well as regarding their deen is the whole process by which the Khilafat was abolished. Now, you might find it peculiar that a group of people thousands of miles away who had no physical or political relationship with the Ottoman Empire should be so moved by the possibility of the abolition of the Khilafat. So the whole issue of Khilafat, the abolition of Khilafat, and the attitudes that Muslims should have towards it became a very critical issue in the crystallization of Muslim Indian thought. The other current that had also a very large effect on the formation of Muslim Indian thought is the events that were taking place in the Near East, in West Asia, particularly the rise of nationalisms that were to some extent related to Islam, but mostly were not, and the various positions that were taken regarding foreign incursions by thinkers in various parts of the Muslim world. The effects, for example, of the tobacco rebellion and the constitution movement in Iran was very, very profound on large segments of the Muslim population. The rise of the Egyptian national movement by Mustafa Kani, not Mustafa Kemal, Mustafa Kani, affected and influenced a lot of people in India in terms of how can Indian Muslims relate to a sense of nationalism where their entire identity was related to their deen rather than to their being Indian. Because being Indian also implied very largely being Hindu, because the majority of the population is Hindu. So these issues of identity, these issues of loyalty, which have come also with us to contemporary times, were first discussed in an important way and led to very important practical results in India. Now, something that you should know also, I believe, that you should not try to fragment modern Islamic thought from some of its traditional routines. I tried in the one of the first early lectures that we had when we had Khalid Bilal, where I tried to show you that the promptings for action are not necessarily based upon the challenge of modern times. They're not necessarily based on the challenge of European thought or Western thought. They sometimes can spring from traditional sources. They sometimes can spring from traditional reactions that are rooted in their own cultures and contexts. Now, in India, the spread of Islam spread in India really in three waves. The first wave were the earliest. I mean, it came with the early conquest of Islam, like Muhammad al-Qasim, who opened the area that we now call Sindh. But then it stopped. So there are parts of India or Pakistan that have been Islamicized for centuries, from the beginning of the rise of Islam. That's one section. The other section of India that became Islamicized is through a result of constant incursions and conquests, primarily from what is now Afghanistan and northwest Iran. Movements emerged in these countries that instead of moving west towards the Islamic heartlands, moved east and south into India. And you have people like Hamid Ghaznawi, who had a profound effect in terms of the occupation of areas that became strongly Muslim, like Delhi, the area around Delhi and Lucknow, or what was known Pakistan as the United Provinces. So the second wave came with rulers, came with the court, came with the absorption of Muslims into the ruling, absorption of Hindus into the ruling power structures that were Islamic, and then they became Islamic states. The third wave is really due to the movement of mainly Sufi teachers and Sufi shuyukh, and that became powerful in eastern India, in Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh and Bengal, and in areas of India which became affected by the teachings of great shuyukh, like Chishtiya or Naqshbandiya, which established deep roots inside South India, and in the case of Bengal, by the Sahrawardis. So you have three historical routes for the growth of Islam. And each one of these routes led to a certain way of thinking that subsequently emerged in modern times to be associated with one or two schools of thought. Very crudely put. You had, as a consequence of that, basically three kinds of currents of thought emerging in the 19th century and 20th century amongst Indian Muslims. One current relates to the entire Wahhabi and Neo-Wahhabi movement that became very powerful, as we discussed earlier, among sections of the ulama, and led to, we talk about Sayyid Ahmed Bareilly and how he came from Mecca and started the Wahhabi movement. So there was a segment of the population that became very Salafi-oriented, that became very strict in its interpretation of Islamic tenets, and was linked to the, what I can call the fundamentalist Wahhabis of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, they had certain perceptions as to how to respond to both the majority Indian population as well as to the rule of the British. A second segment of the Indian Muslim movement emerged out of the works of the Sufi tariqas. And the Sufi tariqas, especially the Chishtiya, and the Sahrawardis. Now the Chishtis are the Iranian tariqa that became very powerful in what is now Pakistan and northern India. And the Chishtiya, part of the appeal of the Chishtiya was what I would call the syncretic approach. That is, an attempt to find common grounds between the Islam of the Sufis and the Hindu population. So, and it was very successful because the movement of the Chishtiyas in India probably represented a very important element in the conversion of large segments of the Hindu population to Islam. Now, these people did not confront Hinduism straight on. They tried to find areas and points of contact in Hinduism and Islam that allowed them to reach out to the Hindu masses. And as a result, they succeeded in converting a large proportion of the peasantry that came under their control to Islam. The Sahrawardis were very active in Bengal, and their approach was slightly different. But nevertheless, they were also successful in attracting to Islam over, of course, centuries, over 200, 300, 400 years, large segments of the population to Islam. So you had really an Islamic mix. You had a mix of Muslims. The majority of the population of Muslims were really very poor peasants who came to Islam as a result of the activities of Sufi tariqas. You had another segment of the population that was linked to the religious heartland of the Muslim world. And they tended to be, if they're oriented towards the Wahhabi movement, obviously extremely orthodox. And you had a third segment that was related to the Islam of the courts, the ruling power, and the parties. Now, why I mention this is as follows: is because part of the appeal of the Sufi orders is the popularization of the doctrine of Ibn Arabi. Now, I don't know if you have studied Ibn Arabi in your other courses, but Ibn Arabi is probably the greatest synthesizer of Sufi thought and Islamic Sufi thought. And he came up with what became subsequently known as the concept of Wahdat al-Wujud. If you bear with me a minute, because all this might sound very distant from what this means. What has this got to do with our modern day? Or the unity of existence. The unity of existence is a very, very subtle concept. But in the hands of people who wanted to popularize it, it allowed them to approach other religions on equal terms. That is very, very crudely put. This concept of Wahdat al-Wujud allows the practitioner to believe that there is behind all reality the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. and that all religions are really manifestations of the effulgence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And all religions at some point, in one shape or another, even if they don't recognize it, worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore the approach to people who are of different faiths and different religions is to find common ground between them and Islam as seen from that perspective. And that allows the man in da'wah or the teacher or the sheikh in the case of the Sufis to approach people on that principle. That there really is, Islam is not that different from Hinduism in its ultimate form, because Hinduism, or whatever religion you're talking about, has certain points of connection with Islam, and that point is in this unity, concept of unity of existence. So, but that unity of existence also leads you, or this concept leads you to de-emphasis on Sharia, de-emphasis on the elements that are particular to Islam, and can lead to all kinds of deviations. By the time of the 18th century, this concept and the activities of the Sufi tariqas really led to a very strange combination of a Hinduized Islam, if you want to call it that. If you want to see a variation of what I'm talking about, if you go to Indonesia now, probably, to some parts of it, Java and so on, you'll find there is this strange mixture between the traditional forms of belief and this kind of syncreticity and Islam.
Is this a forerunner to Sayyid Ahmad?
No, this is, I'll come to that inshallah. By the 17th, 18th century, there was a very strong reaction against that by some of the more Sharia-minded ulamas. There's a man called Ahmed Sirhindi, who basically attacked the concept of wahdat al-wujud and said that this is not the right approach that one should take in propagating da'wah because it can lead to weakness of the Sharia. And propagated the concept of wahdat al-shuhud, which is the unity of witnessing. That is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be reached by any possible human method. And that what we are seeing is not the manifestations of the direct manifestations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we're seeing in fact the manifestations of His sifat, of His attributes. From Ahmed Sirhindi, we come to a man called Shah Waliullah, who is a very important figure in Indian Islam. Now Shah Waliullah of Delhi formalized the doctrine of Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi, and without really attacking the Sufis. So he created the first religious authority, as it were, that emphasized the importance of the maintenance of Islamic orthodoxy, but nevertheless kept room for it for the Sufi movement. And as a result, he did not alienate the major shuyukh who had a very powerful role to play in India, especially through what is known as the peers. This is a Persian word which means leader or founder. So a peer, if you come across a peer, maybe you've been to India or Pakistan, you find this, people visiting the peers and visiting the shrine of peers. So it's mainly tombs of saints. But the peer movement is based on the control of the tariqah or the sub-tariqah by a direct descendant of the founder of the tariqah. So you have, in Pakistan for example, tens of people who claim they are peers, descendant of the Chishtis or descendant of Nizamuddin Awliya or whatnot, claiming loyalty and allegiance of hundreds of thousands of people in the name of that particular tariqah. So Shah Waliullah had started the first attempt, as it were, to synthesize the beliefs of the masses, which were very oriented towards this saint visiting and the peer business of the slightly eccentric Sufism that we find in India, and the traditional Islamic orthodoxy associated with the more conservative elements of the ulama. Now, this started a movement subsequently in a place called Deoband. It started a seminary or a Islamic madrasa in Deoband, which became the heartland of tolerant Indian Islam, an Islam that is rooted in orthodoxy in some cases, especially the Hanafi fiqh, but nevertheless was open was flexible in its approach to other sects, especially the Shia, was very flexible in its approach to the shuyukh of Tasawwuf, and was very flexible in its approach to the Hindu majority, in the sense that they were non-threatening. They did not want to overthrow or to forcefully convert them, as it were. So, the Deobandi school was founded in 1868 and became a center for this study. So, sometime around the late part of the 19th century in India, you have basically 4 schools competing for the attention of the Muslim and non-Muslim world. School number 1 was the Bareilly, the person I told you about who focused on the introduction of Wahhabism. So let's call that the Wahhabi effect. School number 2 is the Deobandis. By the way, these 2 main divisions in Indian Islam have been imported to England. So if you go to some of the mosques of the Indian, are you Deobandi or are you Bareilly? I'll call this reformers and prophets. The third school of thought is Sayyids, or the Ali movement, which is let's call it rationalist. And the fourth school is traditional peers. The fifth school of thought, I'll put it in brackets because it was never very overt, tended to align itself to this. So you find out Shia and the Ali movement, who found their, of course, this is now late 19th century. One of the first people to emerge out of the Deobandi school, out of the Reformist school, who had to contend with the rise, as it were, of not the rise, but the imposition of non-Muslim rule on India, is a man by the name of Shibli Nu'mani. Now, Shibli Nu'mani was born in Lucknow, or near Lucknow, and he became involved early days with the Deobandi movement and became secretary, of their famous madrasa, which was called Dar al-Ulum. And out of this movement, out of the Dar al-Ulum also, emerged the newspaper, the famous magazine called Al-Nahda. And out of the Deobandi movement also came the formal organization of Indian Muslim ulama called Nahdat al-Ulama. Now, this Nahdat al-Ulama had a very profound influence on people from Southeast Asia also, because a lot of early Malay ulamas who couldn't go to Azhar ended up here. And they also became influenced by the organizational mechanisms of Nahdat al-Ulama in Deoband, and brought back to what was then the Dutch East Indies, the organizational framework, and basically the organizational manuals of Nahdat al-Ulama. So this school had quite an effect beyond it. Now, Shibli Nu'mani again introduced a kind of, first of all, he stood against Sayyid Ahmed Khan. Because as we saw, after the collapse of the Indian insurrection, what was then known as the mutiny, Sayyid was probably the only Muslim activist on the stage. And his rational scientific approach to what Islam and Muslims should do began to sweep the day, particularly since after the formation of the university, and a lot of the Muslim elites began to send their children to Aligarh. As a result, Sir Sayyid's influence began to be seen as a threat by some of the more traditional ulama. Of course, people from Bareilly just refused it entirely, as being at the hands of, the whole thing is in the hands of the kuffar, and any dealings with Aligarh should be immediately dismissed. And Sir Sayyid himself was the next thing to an apostate. Deoband's relationship to Sir Sayyid was much more complex. Some of the leaders of Deoband ended up in Aligarh. And in fact, Shibli Ahmadi taught Persian and Arabic there. But because he was raised in a traditional environment, there was always this ambivalence between this movement, which taken one step further would end up in secularism, and therefore a secular movement of Muslims rather than a movement of people who are committed to the deen. This Sir Sayyid may have been on the borderline, as we saw in earlier lectures, but Deoband was definitely a non-secularist movement. Their main interest was to maintain the integrity and identity of Muslims without necessarily ignoring the vitality of modern institutions. But even though he taught Persian and Arabic, he studied also in West Asia. He was in Syria, he was in Egypt, and traveled quite a lot, and developed a very important network of relationships there. After he left Aligarh, he came to another ulama in Lucknow and became secretary of the madrasa, Darul Ulum, where he began to introduce a curriculum that was basically a balance between the secularism of Aligarh and the extreme orthodoxy and rigidity of the ulamas of Bareilly. And one of the great features of this Darul Ulum was it had very sound scholarship, had really extremely interesting biographical works on Prophet ﷺ, on some of the great Sahaba, on the activities of the great Muslim figures of the past, like Salahuddin and so on. And you could say that this was the beginning of the popularization of Muslim biographies that we find around us all the time. If you pick up a lot of the, probably poorly researched, but quite vibrant descriptions of the early Muslim heroes, you find that in one way or the other they all go back to the output that came out of Darul Ulum from Shibli Nu'mani's work. So Shibli Nu'mani, in that sense, was the originator and propagator of the heroic dimension in approaching leading Muslim figures in the past. Primarily to build up pride by Muslims in their past, and to build up pride by Muslims in their heroic achievements. And even though the scholarship itself may have been somewhat dubious, and unfortunately some of this kind of hagiography, if you want to call it that, has also come into modern times, where you find a lot of tracts dealing with this person or that person or this event or that event, that is not necessarily well researched and can easily be attacked for being poor scholarship. But that genre, as it were, of biographical writing can be traced to what came out of Darul Ulum. Of course, in those days, to have this kind of popular works available at the common level was a great event. It was something that was completely unknown. And the literary and editorial output from there was quite important. Also, one of the features of Deoband was to avoid controversy. They avoided any divisive issues that may split Muslims. And, for example, they had no position on the virtues of each of the four Sunni madhabs. Their relationship to the Shia were accommodating without being accepting to all of their doctrines. Unfortunately, the Shia did not produce, at that point, any center or significance. Most of the Shia leadership was involved in ways of appeasing the British. And the traditional leaders like Raja Mahmoudabad, the Aga Khan, the proto-Shia, Sayyid Amir Ali, were all very close to the British and saw the salvation of Muslims in India as being within the camp of the British, loyal subjects of the British Crown, primarily, I think, to avoid being swept by a tide of Hindu nationalism that was just beginning to emerge. This was, of course, before the formation of the Muslim League.
Are they the ones who are Tablighi Jamaat?
Now, Tabligh is a different thing. These are Tabligh is primarily a movement of da'wah. It's an organizational movement that is not really too involved in fiqh, is involved in kalam, it's involved primarily in promoting da'wah and getting people to do their ibadat. And it's like a preacher, a wandering preacher, but it's very well organized and it seems to be still very active. But the Tabligh Jama'at started in India before partition. And if you tell me which school, they're more somewhere in between. They're more Salafis, they're less accommodating to other sects. But they do good work, I think, simply by calling people to Islam and reminding people of their obligations and duties. Now, the other point about this whole Deobandi movement is basically a refutation of Sir Sayyid Ahmad's theory that Islam and science are compatible. These people, especially Shibli Rahmani, wrote in his two major works, Kalam and Ilm al-Kalam, said that religion and science have nothing to do with each other. They operate at different spheres of knowledge, different spheres of cognition, different spheres of experience. And that any attempt to try to link the two is doomed to failure and does a great disservice to Islam. So, a position which I don't find objectionable at all, frankly, because the realm of the deen, the realm of the ghaib, the realm of religion, does not necessarily lend itself to being subjected to the criteria of logic and reason. Of course, this is not necessarily Shia perspective. This is the perspective of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, that Islam is primarily a religion of reason, a religion of science, and it commends scientific activities and it commends dealing with the modern world on the grounds that it is a rational system of beliefs. The whole Deobandi movement and Shibli's thought, and this has come also across if you talk to people from the movement, is that the realm of religion, the realm of ghaib has to be seen separately and differently, has different keys to it. And this is to some extent due to also to their connections with the Sufi tariqas, particularly the Naqshbandis, who are less prone to exaggerated attempts to find common ground between Islam and other religions. Now, this brings us, Shibli Rahmani is 1857 to 1914. Now we come to probably the main figures of pre-partition Indian Islam. The man that I'd like to talk about is a man called Abu Kalam Azad. One of the effects of this kind of climate, religious climate, in earlier 20th century India, late 19th century India, is that it created amongst Muslims a sense of doom. As the empire crashed, the Mughal empire crashed, the mutiny was crushed with great ferocity by the British. And these people were completely disoriented. The leadership class was cut off. Hindus were becoming more educated in Western schools. They were achieving greater rapport with the British administration. One of the reactions that took place is the original Takfir and Hijra movement, which you might have heard of in Egypt in the last few years, and the extreme variations of these movements, like the armed Islamic group in Nigeria and so on, had its predecessors in the what is known as the Muhajirun movement. Sometime around the late 19th century, a lot of the Salafi-minded Muslims, not Salafi-minded Muslims, but a lot of the Muslims affected by Wahhabi thinking came to the realization under the prompting by the ulama that they cannot live in India anymore. So huge migration took place. They all left India en masse. Some tried to get to Iran, where they were stopped at the border and died of thirst and so on. Others tried to get to Afghanistan, where they were supposedly it was Dar al-Islam, because India became Dar al-Harb, where they were attacked by Muslim tribesmen and a lot of them were left to die. So these are some of the millenarian movements associated with the collapse of Muslim power. And we have variants of that these days too. People refuse to deal with the situation in hand, and they find intellectual and religious justification by withdrawing. And these give rise to things like the Takfir of Hijrah movement in Egypt, and the armed Islamic groups in Algeria and so on. That is an unwillingness to deal with society because it's deemed to be in Jahiliyyah. Now this was the beginning of the beginning of the modern response to this kind. Now Azad himself, Abu Kalam Azad, came from a family of noted ulama originally from Herat, from Afghanistan, that is now Afghanistan. But his father, Khairuddin, because he refused to accept British rule, his grandfather, migrated to Mecca and established himself in Mecca. And Abu Kalam was born in Mecca in 1888 from, of course, an Indian father. His mother was Arab. So his first language was Arabic. He spoke Arabic like a native Hijazi, I suppose, because he was born in Mecca. Towards the end of the 19th century, his father went back to Calcutta for a visit, and he was asked to stay there, and the whole family moved from Mecca to Calcutta. But as I said, Abu Kalam had perfected his language, perfected his linguistic skills, and his father, being quite a learned gentleman, and affected by the climate of Mecca, which was to some extent Deobandian orientation, in the sense that Mecca at that point was before it fell under the rule of the Wahhabis, was a center also of Shafi'i thought, although it was Hanafi, and it was also a center for manifestations of Tasawwuf, and the Qadri order was very strong in Mecca, so were the Shafi'is.
The Qadri?
Yes. Mecca, in fact, Mecca and Medina were the centers of a lot of these orders. And of course the Idrisis, who came from Libya, moved on. So before Mecca fell under the control of the Wahhabis, it was a very liberal place, you want to call it that, religiously. And some of the expansiveness of the openness of the scene in Mecca affected Khairuddin. Khairuddin was very, very anti-Wahhabi. That's Abu Kalam's father. And a bit of the anti-Wahhabism thought also affected his son. And his father also was very tolerant of the Shia as such, but he was a great lover of Ahlul Bayt, and all of his teachings and writings and sermons dealt with the love of Ahlul Bayt as a precondition for the completion of one's Islam. But he did not become a doctrinal Shia in the sense of the Jafar and so on. Abu Kalam was given the traditional Muslim education, what is known as a Durus al-Nizamiyya, which apparently he hated because he thought it was all useless, and dealt with knowledges that were little purpose, little used to. But what stuck with him, obviously, was the love of God and the love of Prophet. In his early youth, he traveled quite a lot. He went back to Mecca to see his mother's family, and he went back to the Middle East. And as I said, he's very, very fluent in Arabic. His Arabic was superb. He spoke it. He wasn't native, he spoke it as a native. He, again, in his travels in West Asia, began to be influenced somewhat by the experience of Egyptian nationalism, especially in the post-Arab phase of Mustafa Kemal and people who were associated with the anti-British movement. So when he came back to Calcutta again, his first act was, one of his first acts was to start a newspaper called the Hilal. Now, this, I believe, was named after the Hilal of Egypt. The magazine Al Hilal, which inshallah we'll talk about later, not this later, is a very important journal. It's as important as the Manar, as a newspaper. In the sense it was a literary journal, literary, cultural, and religious journal that was aimed at not just modernist Muslims, but contemporary Muslims. It had a huge impact, huge circulation, both in Egypt and outside. Egypt at that point was the center of the literary and religious ferment taking place in the Arabic world. And the Hilal, which was subsequently edited by another famous figure, which we talked about, man called Mustafa Ahad. At that point, was edited by a great lover of Ahl al-Bayt who happened to be a Christian, by the name of Georgi Zaidan. You may have heard of the biography of Imam Ali alayhi salam, written by Georgi. There's also another one by Georgi Zaidan, both Christians. But this fellow was the editor of the Egyptian Hilal. When he came back to Calcutta, he started the Urdu Hilal. And the Urdu Hilal had a really, it was an explosion in the Indian Muslim scene. It was the first time that a modern journal that was neither slavish imitator of the scienticism of Sayyid, neither was it what is known as the Kutub al-Safra, neither was it these journals that preferred to be of a religious nature. It had a very high literary content, extremely well edited, and very, very powerful effect on the Indian Muslim population, combining a number of new themes in Muslim thought, which inshallah we'll talk about. So, and he was only in his 20s at that point. It was, I believe, in 1912, when the Indian Hilal started. Hilal lasted for a few years and it was shut down by the authorities, by British authorities, and then reappeared as something called Hilal. And it was closed down also after a few issues. The importance of the Hilal really lies partly, as I said, in the quality of the editorial articles, the quality of the Urdu that Abu Kalam Azad was a great proponent of, and the airing of the key concepts that affected Muslims in India and probably elsewhere in the world. Inshallah we'll talk about them because they have an important subsequent developments in the Indian Muslim world. What are the aims of the Hilal? What were the aims of the Hilal newspaper and the movement associated with Abu Kalam Azad? Now, Abu Kalam Azad, just to keep giving a very rough description of what happened to him afterwards, he became head of the Indian Congress and was a Minister of Education in India. They refused to move to Pakistan after partition. One is the reinterpretation, this is my reading, of the meaning of the ayah dealing with the Amr bil Ma'ruf. Can you all recognize Arabic script or you can? My script is Qur'an in Arabic, so it might not be very easy. Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar. Of course we all know what we think we all know what this means. What does it mean in the context of the evolution of Islamic thought? The main issue relating to this is that in the ayahs that which appears in the Quran Kareem, in Surah Al-Imran, being the first one, is that the traditional interpretation of the Amr al-Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar is that it is a function of the ulama. It is a duty obligated upon them, not upon Muslims as a whole. And therefore, it is the ulama who are responsible for acting directly and on behalf of the community, on behalf of the Muslim community, because this ayah specifically refers to, or their interpretation of the ayah specifically refers that this is a function and duty and obligation upon those in the know. His claim, Abu Kalam's claim, was that this is not an obligation upon the ulama, it is an obligation upon all Muslims. And that the limitation factor that basically allowed the ulama to keep for themselves the right for action, the right for al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, is something that is not warranted by a reading of the Quran and reading it as an obligation that befalls all Muslims. This he calls al-Usul, that is, it is the key foundation for action on the part of Muslims. That is the injunction to enjoin good and to deter evil is the basis of action for the community as a whole. It is not limited to the ulama. Therefore, the scene of action of Muslims is not hierarchical. It is not that a certain type of action is limited to a certain class of people. That the entire community is responsible for it. Which leads him to the second reading. This is al-Usul, this is the foundation principle of action. And this is obligatory upon all the members of the community equally. Therefore, all members of the Ummah are responsible equally. Which leads us to the second question, democracy. And the nature of leadership in Muslims. Democracy is essential. Not because it is something that is just, or something that is workable, or something that is least disadvantageous. It's essential because it's the only way that the Ummah as a whole can act collectively. If you don't divide responsibilities between groups within the Ummah, and therefore giving people differential responsibilities and obligations, the only way that a mass of people can act is through the democratic mechanism.
Is he talking about democracy as we understand?
Yes, Western democracy, in the sense that we go and vote. We all participate in the process of choosing, making choices in a public way. This leads you to the nature of leadership, or the nature of authority. Leadership of the Muslims in India, that, as I described earlier, had fallen really between two stools. The oligarch movement people, who in his more extreme manifestations were Western secularists, and traditional ulama. Both of them took upon themselves, or claimed for themselves, leadership of the community. If you follow this principle, that we are all responsible as Muslims to enjoin good and to deter evil as a foundation principle of our action, therefore, and the way that we manifest that action on a political and social field is through democracy, therefore, we are also enjoined to choose our own leadership with the same theme. Now, you have to put everything in context, as I said. His context was there were two poles of authority. Traditional ulamas, who seem to be out of touch, who seem to be too hidebound, who seem to be too committed to routine repetition of ancient texts. And on the other hand, you find westernized, secularized, perhaps, Muslims who are completely disconnected with the mass of the population. So, the solution to it, not the solution, but using the kind of deductive reasoning that he has here, is that you end up with a situation of democracy and a situation where leadership emerges as a result of democratic proceedings. And he said in his writings that this was a principle. This is in fact shura. Shura is not the limitation of the right to select and rule to a group of people only, but to the mass of the population. And that this was first betrayed by the Amawids. And he had a whole series of articles attacking the Umayyads as being responsible for the destruction of the foundation principle of Islam. And of course, after this, there's a whole industry emerged of anti-Umayyad thinking, which claimed that the beginning of the end of pristine Islam is the imposition of monarchical and dictatorial rule. It's true, but not necessarily in this sense. He also, in this process, by claiming that the role of leadership falls in consequentially after the decision to behave democratically as a result of you acting out the foundation principle of Islam, is that authority over the Ummah cannot be inherited, cannot be assumed by only certain people who go through certain methods of education, be it traditional Hausa or traditional Azhari education or Western education. That this is authority is a function of the mass as a whole as a result of their requirements to act out their deen through democratic principles. So democracy to him is an article of the deen, basically. So you can see how the evolution of thought, of Muslim thought, has moved along this axis, along a certain arc.
Did he get these ideas from Hijaz, where he was studying?
No, when he started A Allawi in his early 20s, he was his own I'm sure he was influenced by other people. He was influenced by Sayyid, he was influenced by Shibli Nahmani. He was, in fact, asked to edit the science section of the Nadwa newspaper, of the Nadwa Al-Ulama. And this newspaper, he was in charge as to the modern articles. But he started the Hilal, to some extent, I think, influenced by modernist thinking in Egypt, and influenced by the national movement in Egypt. But it's only speculation. You can't really say. He wrote a kind of biography called Tadkirat, autobiography. And in that he does state that he was very much influenced by Mustafa Kamil and Manar, especially. Of course, Manar plays a very large part later in his tafsir, or Tarjuman part. He wrote a very important tafsir, which had enormous impact in India, and is a very good, well, it's not a complete tafsir, it's not a bad tafsir. In Surah Al-Fatiha is a whole book. It's translated into English. Inshallah, look at it, I'll bring it.
Is this a reaction of his, or is he saying this is what Islam actually is? Or
yes. He's saying that, but you have to understand the condition in which
yeah.
He's saying that in the condition of Indian Muslims. The reason I'm bringing all this up is that if somebody presents various theses about what Islam is, you have to put it in the context of where he's saying it. There are very few people in the Muslim world like Jamaluddin Asadabadi. There aren't that many people who are completely uprooted, who have no connection to time and place. Very few people. And this is really indicative. I'll continue with that. His third thesis, or the Hilal, which came out in a number of articles, is that Muslims as a whole cannot submit to the rule of non-Muslims. In the context of India, really, it means it's a call upon Muslims in India to participate in the struggle against the British. And therefore, not to stay aloof from the struggle against the British, which was then being led by Hindus, and not to commit the political action of Muslims to the very narrow boundaries prescribed by the elite who wanted to be slavish to the British, or the traditional ulama who said we want to have nothing to do with you guys. So he opened the door, as it were, for Muslims to cooperate with non-Muslims against alien authority. Of course, that begs the question as to what should replace that authority subsequently. We'll talk about that later. He says Muslims, issue number 4 is, back to issue number 3. If you are obliged to participate in a struggle to remove alien rule, i.e. non-Muslim rule, what should be your attitude towards rule that is not necessarily non-Muslim, but has no color, no shape, let's say secular? And in the context of India, what he was saying is that where Muslims are unable to establish their authority over non-Muslims, where they are unable to do that, mark my words. Therefore, the best deal for Muslims is to ask for a non-religious secular state, i.e., to bring it home to earth. We as Muslims, well, I don't know any of you are British Muslims, or I'm a Muslim. If you're living in this country permanently for the rest of your life, you have nowhere else to go, and that this country is unlikely to be run by Muslims for some time to come, then the best bet for Muslims here is not to demand Christian rule, but to demand non-religious rule that has no religious color, so that no particular religion, no particular group can claim primacy. And it's on the basis of that he refused to join Pakistan, because he said the Muslims have a better deal in a secular India than in a so-called Islamic state that would be run by tribals and feudals and army officers. It's possibly true. I don't comment.
What is main reason why he didn't want to join Pakistan?
Of course, a lot of personality problems too. That's part of it. But I'm giving you this is not a psychological course. So. However, where Muslims are rulers, they must never abandon rule, even if they're in the minority. Yes, all of these, you see, nothing is new, really. Everything repeats itself. The only thing that is beyond newness and oldness is the Almighty Allah. This is nothing. Just a blip in the screen. The cooperation with non-Muslims is therefore a requirement if you're going to lead to the abolition or to the overthrow of non-Muslim rules. To some extent it was influenced perhaps by the role of the Copts in the Egyptian national struggle against the Brits. There is also an element of pan-Islam in the Hilal, but not so strongly emphasized that you can say he was a pan-Islamist. He was a pan-Islamist in the Indian context, but not an ideological pan-Islamist the way that, for example, Sayyidina Ali did. Now, all of these ferment that took place in the world of Muslim India and the beginning of the crystallization of the Muslim Indian identity was greatly accelerated by an event which you may have heard of, the partition of Bengal. Now, Bengal is a part of India that is the first part of India that was colonized by the British and was probably the largest province in terms of population. And it was practically half divided between Muslims and Hindus. And one of the early agitations of the Aligarh movement was to demand that Bengal be partitioned, because Muslims were unable to reach any kind of political equality in the context of a slight Hindu majority, and in the context of a state where the majority of the civil servants reporting to the British were Hindus. So one of the effects of the campaign of the Aligarh movement was to demand a separate condition for Muslims in India. They managed to convince a man called Lord Minto, who was one of the first governors of India, viceroys of India in the 20th century, and which led to the famous decision to partition Bengal to Muslim India, essentially. Now, this partition crystallized the Indian Muslim movement and began to get them more involved in the action of politics, and created also paradoxically a lot of subcurrents, undercurrents, some of which refused to cooperate with the British. Now, all of these things, the Hilal, just in parenthesis, was closed by the British, and he was thrown in jail for a number of years in command for calling for the overthrow of British rule in the Hilal. When he emerged out of jail after World War I, the issue that crystallized the condition of Indian Muslims and that allowed them to begin to operate on the national stage was the Khilafat movement. Now, the Khilafat movement in 1920, 1904, was a movement really by Indian Muslim intellectuals and ulamas to have a powerful say for the Muslim community regarding the condition and the status of the Khilafah. When the issue of the Khilafah became subject to discussion after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was a number of articles written in the British press about the need to abolish the Khilafah, and that the Khilafah was a source of instability and created dual loyalties and was a kind of evil institution. So the beginning of the Khilafat movement in India was to counter that, was to counter the call for the abolition of the Khilafah in the Western press, which was then influencing the participants in the various congresses that were supposed to be designing the post-war world. Places like Versailles and San Remo and Lausanne and so on, out of which the political boundaries of the Ottoman Empire were being decided. So the Khilafat movement also allowed for the cooperation of Hindus with Muslims in an issue that galvanized Muslims but was not necessarily a threat to them. So one of the first people who called for Hindu participation in the Khilafat movement was Gandhi. Gandhi was one of the leading lights, not leading lights, but he was certainly a figure in the Khilafat movement, and called for massive Hindu participation in it as a way of pressuring the British into making concessions which we hope would lead ultimately to Swaraj or Indian independence. But the Khilafat movement attracted all the leading lights of the Indian world, Indian Muslim world. Abul Kalam Azad, the two brothers associated with the Khilafat movement are a man called Muhammad Ali and Maulana Muhammad Ali and Shawkat Ali. Both of them were, one was a Cambridge graduate, the other was an Oxford graduate, who found their deen after they went back with Oxford degrees. They became important figures in the Khilafat movement. Abul Kalam Azad was should be dead at that point, but Sulaiman Nadwi, all of the names associated with the Indian movement became organized through the Khilafat movement, and Gandhi demanded that Congress also participate actively in the Khilafat movement as a way of bringing Hindu-Muslim cooperation together without necessarily affecting the main program that they had towards independence. Of course, Azad also supported it with some religious justification, and I think it was one of the ayahs of Quran Kareem where there is an ayah that says something to the effect that that Muslims should cooperate with those who are not attacking them, which they should tolerate those who are not attacking them or demanding their destruction. And in that sense, Hindus are not attacking Muslims; they're not demanding the elimination and destruction of their deen. It is rather the British who are doing that. So there was also a religious justification founded for Hindu-Muslim cooperation in the Khilafat movement.
Are you talking about the establishment of Khilafat, Ottoman Khilafat?
Yes. Now, I'll give you some background on that. I think we may have talked about the circumstances after World War I, when the Ottoman Khilafat was being abolished. Now, there was a campaign against its abolition by a large number of figures throughout the Muslim world. In Egypt, even in Iran, there was people who demanded that the Khilafah should not be abolished as a religious institution. And in India, all this was galvanized under the Khilafah movement. And it was a very powerful movement, not just by intellectuals and ulamas. It was a movement that involved millions and millions of people. There were demonstrations, sit-downs, riots, disturbances in major Indian cities, demanding that the Khilafah is maintained when the British were talking about its possible abolition, and then demanding its restitution after Mustafa Kemal abolished it. After Mustafa Kemal abolished it, and there was no going back, the Khilafah movement began to disintegrate. But the importance of the movement might sound a bit quixotic. People in India demonstrating about the Khilafah in Istanbul. What does it have to do with that? But it is to do with the overall attitude that Muslims had in India towards Islam, towards institutions dealing with the Muslims.
Was Sayyid Ahmad Khan?
No, he had already died, Sayyid Ahmad Khan. But the Aligarh movement, which had then began to mature and then break up a bit, we're talking now about 1920s, certain elements associated with it began to be involved in that. Now, there are 10 points about the Khilafat movement, the Indian Khilafat movement, that one should note in terms of the evolution of Muslim thought. The first one is that there must always be a Khalifa. That is, the concept of political and religious Khilafah is essential to the living out of one's deen. That's the first one. The second one is that the Khalifa himself must be obeyed. Whoever he is, there should be total obeisance to him. The third one is that once a Khalifa is recognized and established, there should be no rebellion against him. These are the standards of the Indian Khilafat. The fourth one is that the Ottoman Sultan should be the Khalifa for that time and for all time. That basically a restitution of the Ottoman Empire. Fifth is that the Muslims within the Ottoman Khilafah must always have authority, within the Khilafah must always have authority over non-Muslims. The sixth point is that all Muslim countries must help other Muslim countries when they come under attack. Here we're talking about 1920-21 when Turkey was coming under attack from Greece, helped by the British and the French. And there was also a large movement to raise funds and war relief and so on for the Turks, mainly from India. And one of the... Sorry?
Number 6.
That was number 6. All Muslim countries must help other Muslim countries. This is something that is frequently overlooked. And if you read Andrew Mango's biography of Ataturk, which came out last year, you end up with the ironic situation that Ataturk, the greatest enemy of the Khilafah in history, was financed nearly entirely by the Indian Khilafah movement. The Ottoman war, the Turkish war effort, was financed by money coming from India. These were the days before oil and Arabs had money. All the money was in India. So they were giving all kinds of millions and millions of pounds went to the Ottoman, the Turkish war effort against the Greeks and the British. Not the British, because the British allowed that kind of transfers. They're playing the usual double game. So it's funny that when Muhammad Ali and Shawkat Ali came, this comes after my late father's biography. He remembers that episode. They came to Baghdad before they went to see Istanbul, before they went to see India. And they were meeting with King Faisal of Iraq to increase the weight and strength of the embassy. And then they flew from Baghdad to Ankara on an Iraqi government plane, especially. When they got to Ankara, they waited for about 1 week to see Mustafa Kemal. And these are the people who financed the Turkish war. He saw that, and he said, Abdul Majid is gone, that's the last Khalifa. There's no more Khilafah, and why am I talking to you Indians? And he told it to them.
And Kamal, did Ataturk speak any other language apart from Turkish?
He spoke French.
No Arabic.
No. Other points, there are four other points. One is that all Muslims must assist the Khalifa, wherever it is. The eighth point, which came up again in the Gulf War, is that the Arab Peninsula cannot be under non-Muslim rule. These are the. If you wanted to join the Khilafah movement in India, you have to sign this document. The ninth point, which is very topical now, is that Al-Qudus must never be under non-Muslim rule.
There was a handout you gave us on the Khilafah movement and certain concepts. I think it was by something by the name of Marwan. I may have the name wrong, but there were certain points that this person raised in relation to the Khilafah. They seem just the same. And also the constitution of the Khilafah movement, or Hizb ut-Tahrir now,
it's like that.
It's just
basically. Probably I gave you the one by. I'm trying to think which one I did. Is it Abdurrahman Kawakilis and al-Farad? And last point, of course, is really just topical, is that all true Khilafists must oppose the British. It seems to be part of the ritual.
Number 4 is
Yes, the Ottoman Sultan has to be the Khalifa.
Oh, okay.
Nobody else should make it. These are basically to remove all other claims.
That's number 9.
I like that too, though. I like that number. It's like the 9 years. I mean, I wasn't a member of the Khilafat. I can't tell. Neither was a member of Qasr al-Tahrir, although some of you maybe. The next thing about Abu Kalam Azad is, this is the Azad of the, it's 4:05. You want to continue or shall I stop?
No.
Stop? I have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
I'll let you all go after. Is we move gradually from this passionate advocacy of Islam to a more accommodating position as he began to become more involved in politics. And he was in and out of jail many times. In one of his jail episodes, he joined the Indian Congress Party, and he joined the Indian Congress Party when the issue of Pakistan was not really on board, and most Indian Muslim thought was directed towards creating separate constituencies and separate voting lists for Muslims rather than partition. In one of his jail sojourns, he spent probably a decade in total in jail. He wrote his famous Tarjuman al-Quran, which is really a tafsir. It's not a but it is written in Urdu. And is considered to be one of the great masterpieces of modern Urdu literature. He didn't do the entire Quran. He did it in 2 parts. One is that there's a whole book on Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Fatiha. And I really think it's a wonderful book in all respects. It's a very, very unique approach to tafsir. He goes into just the Fatiha itself, takes up one entire book, and he goes into the transcendental basis of a lot of the words and letters of the Surah Al-Fatiha. And he delves into not the transcendent unity of all religions, but he also confirms the supremacy of Islam, even though Islam is really the culmination of the final version of 2 religions that were already revealed in any case. In this I mean, you should read it really for its literary interest, even if you don't believe in the way that he interprets the Quran, because you may read it in a way as being very accommodating to other religions and to other faiths. But in reality, it boils down to 3 conclusions, or 3 distillations. Of course, he says that the whole Quran is subsumed in the Fatiha. If one reads the Fatiha correctly, you are reading the entire Book of Allah. First point is that khalas, or salvation, depends on the depth of your iman and a'mal, your faith and good works. This comes out time and time again, that it is iman and a'mal that determines the quality of one's submission. Second point is that all revealed religions are the same. That doesn't mean that modern Christianity or Judaism is the same as Islam. It doesn't mean that. But in their original form, it is. In their original form, they are the same. And this is what he says, that all revealed religions are the same. When they first descend, in whatever form it is, upon established prophets, they are true, they are complete, and they are a form of Islam. That Islam is the final culmination, but only because the other religions, the other revelations were not preserved complete. It's through their distortions that there was another revelation. So, although you read parts of you can read parts of the Tarjuman Quran as being very accommodating to other faiths, but he is accommodating to other faiths, as all Muslims must be. But only if these faiths are genuine, only if these faiths are based on true revelatory experience and not being subjected to any interference by men or any changes. The third point is that ibadah, or worship of Allah can only be accommodated without wasata, without intermediaries. So here, of course, this goes against the notion of having intercession either by saints or by imams or by wilayas. And these are the central features of this Tarjuman. And it is not so much the conclusions that matter really, but the importance of the Tarjuman is in its quality as a literary work and in its very unique approach to interpretation. And in many ways, in terms of tafsir, it has been connected to Tafsir al-Manar, which was an important set of tafsirs that appeared regularly in the newspaper al-Manar. I'm sure we'll talk about that, tafsir later. So, and ultimately, as I said, his reputation is not very high in Pakistan, because they thought he betrayed the cause of. He was also a great enemy of Jinnah. But I think in time, if you look at it historically, he may well have been, his choice may well have been correct. Many Pakistanis, many Urdu speakers who left India for Pakistan after partition, they knew whether they made the right choice or not.
His school of thought, did you say the Allawi school of thought?
Yeah, if you want to call it that, but I think he has his own school. But if he's closer to anybody, certainly to the Diamandis.
Because I was just wondering when you said that with the last point where the ibadah must be a direct communication.
Yes.
I was wondering what is their approach to the Diamandis school for that? Because here it says that they're tolerant towards the Shia, another sect. Tolerant,
yes. No, Diamandis are. You can't say that they were at the cutting edge of modern education. The Diamandis tried to create not necessarily successful attempt to bring Western traditional teaching in some kind of eclectic mix. But in the end, what they managed to produce are ulama who are slightly more open, slightly more tolerant, slightly more accepting.